In terms of Vermeer attributions, because there are only 36 paintings in the world, adding another one to the body of generally accepted works is really very difficult. There's an enormous resistance, both because of the artist's mythical status and also because of the forgery scandal, which makes everybody deeply suspicious of the whole idea of adding a painting by Vermeer.
Sotheby's is the temporary custodian of some of the world's most rare, remarkable and coveted art and objects. In each episode, we'll be exploring the significance and journey of an extraordinary work told by those who know it best. This is The Specialist. On today's episode, we hear from Greg Rubinstein, who choreographed the re-acceptance of a once doubted painting by Vermeer as an authentic autograph work, a complex process of consensus that took over a decade to settle. Greg is Sotheby's head of Old Master and early British drawings worldwide. Netherlandish Old Master drawings are his lifelong passion, so much so that in 2025, the King of the Netherlands appointed him a Knight of the Order of Orange Nassau in recognition of his contribution to the preservation, study and global promotion of 16th and 17th century Dutch art. Let's join Greg now with more.
Ever since his rediscovery in the late 19th century, Vermeer has had an almost mythical status. And there's a good reason why paintings like the Girl with the Pearl Earring are so incredibly world famous. Vermeer was a unique artist because he worked very much on his own and in a totally distinctive way. He seems never to have had any assistants or studio members, and he left only a very small body of work. From the 17th century until the late 19th century, he was almost entirely forgotten as an artist. And so many, many pictures which are famous now were really lost to history for quite some time. It's a small painting, only 25 by 20 centimetres, so less than an A4 sheet of paper. But it's got extraordinary wall power and also amazing calmness and serenity. The composition is very simple. It's a young woman sitting at a keyboard instrument known as a virginal, seeming to have paused in the process of playing to look at the viewer. And over her shoulder, she's got a yellow woolen shawl. And behind her back, you see the edge of a deep, rich blue velvet chair back. There are at least two other paintings of young women playing similar instruments in the National Gallery here in London. But those are much larger pictures. So the type of composition, the type of subject is typical of Vermeer, but the format isn't. Of the small paintings that there are by him, there are only two that have single figures like this shown at a little bit of a distance. The others are close-ups of faces like the Girl with the Pearl Earring. We don't know exactly when this painting was made. Maybe the strongest evidence comes from the hairstyle of the girl. Costume historians who've worked with us on the picture told us that it had to have been made around 1670, 1672. The first secure record of it is in 1904. After that, the painting is widely published in all the literature on Vermeer as being a totally genuine autograph work. In 1937, Vermeer studies have been turned on their head. The known early works of Vermeer are very different from the typical mature ones, and there was a big stylistic gap in between. Then in 1937, a painting was discovered which, to a considerable extent, filled the gap, seemed to be a bridge. Over the course of the next few years, 2 or 3 more similar pictures appeared. One of them happened to be sold to Goering on behalf of Hitler. And then after the war, the man who had engineered that sale, whose name was Han van Meekeren, was arrested and accused of selling Dutch national treasures to the Nazis. He said, "No, I didn't. I painted it. It's a fake." Whereupon there was a fantastic show trial where he painted another fake Vermeer in the courtroom, and was immediately put in jail for forgery. But that was a lot better than treason or selling national treasures. In the light of that scandal, scholars of the day reviewed Vermeer very, very critically, and some of the works that had been accepted by everybody before the war got thrown out. The most important of these scholars was a man called A.B. de Vries, who was the director of the Rijksmuseum. And de Vries had published the painting in 1939 in his book on Vermeer as a genuine work. But in 1948, he did a second edition in which he rejected this. The painting was hidden away in Ireland, and he hadn't seen it for decades. He then went and saw it again, said, "Oh, I was wrong. If I do a third edition, I'll put it back." And he never wrote a third edition. The painting really slipped completely out of the literature and was generally ignored and rejected by most scholars. In fact, it wasn't really taken seriously at all. The Beit family, who owned this painting, decided they were going to sell this picture. And it went to a dealer in London, Marlborough Galleries. It was seen there by a Belgian gentleman, Baron Freddy Rollin. He fell in love with the picture and acquired it in exchange for 4 paintings by Clay, Signac, Bonnard and Riopel. The whole story picks up again shortly after I'd started working at Sotheby's. I was at a reception at Sotheby's in Brussels, was introduced to Baron Rollin. He asked me what I'd been doing before Sotheby's, and I said, "Oh, well, I used to work in museums. I was at the National Gallery of Art in Washington as a research assistant to Arthur Wheelock, the curator of Dutch paintings." And he said, "Oh, Wheelock, the Vermeer man. Well, I've got a Vermeer." And he saw what I was thinking and laughed and said, "I know what you're thinking, but actually this is a really interesting picture and it has this great history." And he told me the early story. The next thing I know, Freddy Rollin has brought the painting in. My first impression when I saw the picture was puzzlement, because in so many ways it looked exactly like Vermeer, both the subject, the type of image, and many parts of the actual painting technique. But then other aspects didn't quite seem to work. The yellow shawl looked complicated and slightly unconvincing. Also, the whole lighting scheme was unsatisfactory. We decided to compare it with the 2 paintings of similar subjects, which ought to be comparable. And we took the painting into the conservation lab and spent a fascinating afternoon looking through microscopes. And the responses were very mixed. The conservators who looked through the microscopes all said, "We believe that these 3 paintings were made by the same person." The art historians were much more hesitant and were saying, "Okay, the technique looks very similar, but there's something that doesn't quite work here." So what we realized was essential was to understand exactly how the painting was made technically. So we commissioned a full technical analysis of the picture, which was started by Libby Sheldon from University College London. All the pigments that were in the painting were exactly the same pigments that Vermeer would have used, but used in the same ways. So, for example, one of the great hallmarks of Vermeer's painting is extensive use of ultramarine, natural ultramarine, which is ground lapis lazuli, this incredibly expensive pigment. But what he did, and hardly anybody else ever did, was that he used it invisibly in the whites of his background walls. So that immediately dismissed any suggestion that it was a later imitation. This small painting is on relatively coarse canvas, and that's something that's very unusual in 17th century Dutch art. Only one other painting that we found on this sort of scale, with this sort of canvas, was Vermeer's Lacemaker in the Louvre. It became clear when we compared the X-rays that there were the same irregularities going through the canvas structure, and so they must actually have been cut from the same piece of fabric. Opinions remained divided. We got a group of 8 specialists. We had Frits Duparc, director of the Mauritshuis. We had Ernst van der Wetering, who was the head of the Rembrandt Research Project. We had the head of conservation at the Rijksmuseum, And it was agreed that clearly some of the problems that there were with the spatial arrangements were being caused by really small 19th century restorations and retouches, and that until we got rid of those, we were never going to be able to know what the painting really looked like underneath it. So with great trepidation, those later restorations were taken off, and the space suddenly fell into place. Almost overnight, the doubters came around and said, actually, this really seems very, very convincing. I have to say that after quite a few years of living with this painting and from fairly early on believing in it myself, it was the most extraordinarily exciting and gratifying moment when that consensus coalesced in a way. The whole idea of having a Vermeer painting in an auction was quite astonishing. The last time that had happened was 1921. It was pretty hard to come up with a pre-sale estimate as well. At that time, only a tiny handful of old master paintings of any type had ever made more than £10 million. In a way, the auction was the ultimate test of whether people believed the attribution or not, because scholars can say yes or no, but to get somebody to actually step up and bid is another thing. So we were rather uncertain about how to estimate the painting and were very cautious in the end, published it as estimate on request. In the event, we were very happy to see several bidders, and it was sold for just under £16.5 million, which for that time was an enormous price for an old master painting. There was one art historian who said to me after the sale, he said he thought that was the first time that any attribution had actually been proved using scientific means. And I don't think he was right. I don't think it was proved. But I think we put together a body of evidence that was so compelling that people had to take it seriously and reassess the painting visually and aesthetically. There's no doubt that the Vermeer episode will go down as one of my happiest memories and one of the most exciting things I've ever been involved in. And it's a source of huge satisfaction going into the exhibition, the Vermeer exhibition at the Rijksmuseum, and seeing it hanging there beside the lacemaker from the Louvre in the place that it should be, but where it wouldn't have been hanging 25 years ago.
Thank you for joining us on The Specialist. This has been brought to you by Sotheby's Financial Services. SFS offers asset-based loans to unlock the value of your fine art, automobiles, and other luxury collectibles. To step further into the world of Sotheby's, visit any one of our galleries, which are open to the public. Go to sotheby's.com to find out more.